weekend barbecues, and that was it.
If creativity thrives under adversity, then it certainly had some nice adverse conditions there to encourage it, because, you know, there was a feeling of hostility towards people that were different, and of uniformity, of a certain sort of lotus-eating, you know, couldn't care less attitude to everyone else, and that's, you know, you still see that.
While I was being born on the other side of the country, the late 1970s saw the birth of the WA original music scene, beginning with a few talented and influential musicians.
Perth had a really great blues scene, one of which I, at the time, probably was a little bit dismissive of, you know, because it was the cool scene, and there was the commercial bands, and then there was the blues scene, and that was it. There was not really much else. There was no original scene, particularly.
I mean, we all hated that whole West Coast blues thing, really, with a passion.
They're all crap. There's no good bands here, in my opinion.
Well, let's face it, it's this very middle-class colonial place, and I mean, you know, what have these people got to be blue about, you know? It just didn't make any sense at all.
What's your take on? I hate your music. I don't want them now. All know before. They don't really care. They never liked your song. They only think they did. Elvis Houston, Elvis Houston, Elvis Houston, we don't care.
My first significant band was a band called the Cheap Nasties that formed in 1976, right at the start. They were essentially the first punk band in Perth to go out and play gigs. And as soon as we played some shows, other people came along to them, like-minded people, and there was a little punk scene that spawned various bands. Dave Faulkner and James Baker met each other through that and formed the Victims, and the Victims were very much the band that everybody adored.
James Baker was a huge thing for me, you know, like, I love punk rock, but he'd actually been there and, you know, he'd met Sid Vicious.
You know, after seeing my idols, I thought, well, I can do this as well.
We actually went to this little pub that's gone now, the Governor Broome Hotel. It was a pub that no one went to, and we just, you know, took the door, and the owner took the bar, and, you know, we put handbills around, and people turned up.
And, like, you know, we got like 150 people. Our first night, all the people wanted to see the new punk band or whatever.
On the world, but I was dinosaur. Doesn't mean I want a facelift. I just think I'm more heinous crime and I ain't gotta be straight. We're not done. We're not done. We're not done.
They didn't want to do it anymore, so the Victims broke up, right? And then Simon phoned me up, and the next day, and I was in the sinus. We were rehearsing 2 days later.
Scientists influenced the grunge bands of the early 90s and in the late 80s. Thurston Moore from Sonic Youth saw them and fell in love with them, and Mark Armour's admitted to being a massive Scientist fan. And guys like Henry Rollins and even Australian bands like the Drones are clearly followed the Scientist lead. There's no doubt that they were heavily influential in a lot of bands in a very underground and kind of in a way that we're only kind of realising now.
You know, the Perth scene before punk was non-existent, really. I mean, apart from I mean, obviously there was great musicians and people that were real scholars of music, but they weren't writing their own music by and large. Punk music and the, you know, bands after that really kind of legitimised the idea that maybe there were creative people under the noses of people in Perth. And after punk, it was, you know, became okay to write your own songs, and there was that feeling of, you know, like people seeing a band and forming a band.
The first time we snuck into a pub was to see these punk bands play, and so that was our kind of immediate real life inspiration to do something ourselves.
The Triffids You know, they were Victims fans, and they were still at high school, and they invited us to their house for a party, and you know, their parents were frightened silly.
We like to think that we had a kind of punk aesthetic back in the late 70s and stuff, so it didn't matter that you didn't really know your instrument all that well. And the whole Perth music scene with its covers bands relied heavily on this idea of a guitarist that could play a whole lot of love note for note. And the singers would all be these kind of prototype Mick Jagger bullshit artists.
When we were there 30 years ago playing around as the Farris Brothers, it was really hard because everyone wanted to hear covers, you know. They were like, yeah, that's pretty good. Do you know any Beatles songs, mate? You know, it was, you know, no one really wanted to hear anything but a cover.
So we completely rejected that, sort of ostentatiously rejected it, and would use every opportunity to say how much we despised it.
Well, the drums rolled off in my forehead, guns went off in my chest. Remember carrying the baby just for you, crying in the wilderness. I lost track of my friends, I lost my kin, cut them off as limbs. I drove out over the flatland, hunting down you and him. The sky was big and empty, my chest felt to explode. I yelled my insides out at the sun at the wide open road. It's a wide open road. It's a wide open road.
The time when I really took notice of a band being from Perth and that being important to that band was Born Sandy Devotional by the Triffids. I just thought that was a work of such power and maturity and excellence that was, I think, a landmark Australian album, what is still one of the top 5 or top 10 Australian albums of all time.
David McCallum from the Triffids was an incredible songwriter, and as a lyricist he was just wonderful. He captured so much about Perth as a city and about his upbringing, and he could write that sort of material even when he was living in squats in London.
Dave included a lot of detail, small detail, and the small detail goes to make up this broad picture of Australia. That is a real picture of Australia rather than a kangaroos and prawns on the barbie kind of picture.
In the 70s, it would have been sacrilege to a lot of people to take the ordinary aspects of living in WA and actually combine it with the theme of a song. But when you actually get the local culture into your song, it can work really well.
Songs like Estuary Bed and, you know, Lonely Stretch and stuff, they kind of seem to come from, you know, the plains and the environment of WA. Those songs would have been different if David McComb had been born in Melbourne. Many people in Perth were inspired by Dave's writing, not inspired to write like him, but inspired to write. And you had to sort of judge yourself against the example of Dave McComb, and that's really tough.
I remember Dave McComb had a cover on the NME, and I thought, you know, he's from Perth, that's pretty cool.
It wasn't until I started reading about the Triffids or the scientists that I wanted to embrace being from here. There's a bit of romance with the history of those bands.
Talent is obviously nothing new to Perth. So why didn't a strong scene develop back then?
Most of us from West Australia, we sort of feel that we have to make that break away. We have to go somewhere else to achieve something. We have to make that enormous trek across that enormous Nullarbor plain. We've got to go over there, or the other way across all those miles of sea. We've got to go somewhere else to to crack it, to make it big.
You know, that feeling of you hadn't made it till you left Perth, and to leave Perth and make it, you had to be incredibly good and you had to believe in yourself. That was definitely part of the early story.
There's that kind of, spirit that you get from having to get up and, get out of there, to move on, because it is a long way from anywhere else.
Full props to those people who did leave Perth and kind of carved out a career for themselves. And that includes, the Triffids and the Scientists and the Hoodoo Gurus. It includes Johnny Diesel and the Injectors. It includes the Baby Animals.
I wake up feeling the same way every day. And I'm aching, numb with the pain that I can't chase away.
Bands like the Baby Animals were really important. They might not be remembered with the same kind of cool quotient as some bands now, but there was a band that all members were from WA, and they really carved an identity for themselves and had incredible success in Australia and some success overseas, and certainly gave it a good shot.
Would I lie? Oh no. One word, one letter, one line, and I'd feel a whole lot better. One look would say it's alright, and I'd feel a whole lot better.
I basically wanted to head to Sydney because that's where my manager was from, and that's where the labels were, and that's where you were going to get a record deal.
In those days, if you stayed here and you had higher ambitions, nothing could have come of it.
I think if the Western Australian music industry had been bigger and the platforms were there to go to the places we wanted to go, I'm sure we would have stayed there.
I took the tube over to Camden to wander around. I bought some.
It did get to a stage in Western Australia where we felt that we had to move to further our careers.
Today I dream of home and not of London anymore. I'm in London still. I'm in London still. Yeah, I'm in London still.
If the WA music scene was ever going to develop, Perth needed all its talent to stop heading east.
Just say the word and I will die for you. And I'd be a flower if you wanted to. 'Cause I've never met anyone quite like you.
The Stems were always this band that kind of had an almost mythical status. They had an album that charted nationally, which was unheard of.
They just had this wonderful melodic 60s vibe to them. And I always remember I went to the first few gigs on the East Coast and they were good.
When we were playing around, there was no national radio network.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to break a town, you had to go to Adelaide and you had to play and do interviews with Adelaide stations and talk to Adelaide journalists and, do some gigs and then move on to the next town.
Because we had a major label and we'd done quite well in the indie scene, we were able to get quite popular, and we thought, well, we'll try and do it from Perth. And we were, I guess, one of the first to try and do that back in the sort of late 80s, but we found it hard. The very first tour we did on the East Coast, we all drove over.
So we took a full crew from Perth and 5-ton Hino and quadruple four-way and these massive PAs that we'd set up and pull down every night and do a 6-7 week tour. And we made a lot of money, but we were broke.
Money aside, just the personal, the blood, sweat and tears involved in those tours must have pushed a lot of bands to the brink.
In October 1987, on the eve of the biggest tour of their career, the Stems split up. It seemed to confirm, especially for record companies, that you couldn't be a successful band if you stayed in Perth.
I know a lot of bands that talking to labels that pretty much said,
we want to sign you, but if you don't move to Melbourne, or if you don't move to Sydney, we can't, you know.
Major label, you know, wants to limit the costs as much as possible. So travelling from Perth to the East Coast constantly can be prohibitive.
Unfortunately, there's not a real positive history of bands moving over and it working out.
It's like curse type thing that keeps happening to Perth bands that do relocate.
You heard nightmarish stories that the band would split up within months, or they'd move into the same house and it would fragment the band.
I was involved with a band called Effigy 10 years ago that signed to Roadrunner Records. Part of their deal was that they had to move to Melbourne, which meant they had ended up in Melbourne with no management and with the label basically managing them, and it was a disaster. It's not like Roadrunner learnt from that. A couple of years ago they were pretty much offering the same thing to Carnival, except I think that they had to change their name and sound more like Nickelback as well.
I mean, if you're going to sign to a label, it's a chance to get your music out to the masses. And that's a great thing, man. That's what I think what bands essentially want. But there's going to be a cost involved in that.
So long, say you with good time. This is my goodbye. This is my farewell. So long, say you with good time. This is my goodbye. This is my farewell.
Everyone's smiling when you sign the deal. It's what happens after that. Record labels will always have ideas on the producer, who might actually shift the sound of what you're doing away from where it was, even down to the photo that's taken, the video you make, and so on. And you've got to be really strong to stay true to what you believe in.
My main thing to get on a record company was so that, you know, the music basically could reach more people and touch more people. That was my main thing, and it took a while because I wanted to sign on the basis that it was going to be a pretty diverse, you know, range and legacy of songs like in the future. So I confused them quite a bit from the start, but it meant that, you know, I wanted to go in strong and that I want to have pretty much complete control of, you know, artistically where it's going.
You're never going to be able to contain Luke Steele, and if you think you can, you're mad. You know, if he wants to make a Metal Machine Music type noise album, he's going to do it. If he wants to make a techno dance-driven project, he's going to do it. With different artists, you've got to be alive to those things and try and work with them. They can be incredibly frustrating at times, and the tyranny of distance can help and hinder that.
We've had a really good run. Yeah. With creative freedom from the record company. No one's ever really meddled with what we're trying to do, and I think that has a lot to do with living in Perth, because they probably forget about us when we're over here writing a record, and then we come back and we're like, here you go, this is what we've been doing.
Too late
They're
to
like,
change
oh.
it now. Well, they can't really drop in, like that's the thing. Like if you
And they're not standing over your shoulder.
If you're a band in Sydney, they would come past your studio with some beers and a pizza and go, let's have a listen to the demos. They just can't ever do that, you know. So we get time to kind of prepare the demos and how we want people to hear them, and we're pretty precious about that.
It's because you're kind of away from the spotlight that these bands can develop, and they can kind of develop in a way that is organic.
I think the longer that we've been in Perth and the longer that we've lived together in this house in North Perth, our sort of goals and what the band's about has become more clear. You know, there's a lot more clarity in what we want to achieve now. after being together for 3 or 4 years.
As an act, a band can grow artistically and also just as a live act over the years, and when the spotlight is on them, they're actually ready for it. Whereas, you know, you go over the East Coast and see bands that are the hot new thing and they're just not cutting it live yet. And so they're getting reviews about not cutting it live yet. And you know, it's like, come on, they've been a band for like 8 months.
It's like a lot of bands that we've seen, you know, that you hear are like, you know, the next big thing, are going to make it and break it, and you go and see them and they're just average, like they're really average. It's like, this would never pass in Perth.
The labels are the ones to blame. I mean, a shit band's a shit band. I mean, they'll learn in time. But these fucking labels.
That phenomenon of people jumping on something quickly and signing it and you know, recording an album too quickly has happened in all parts of the world, and it's definitely more likely in Sydney and Melbourne.
Perth's a consistent A&R source now, and record label. People for the last couple of years have kept a very, very close eye on what's going on in Perth. They never used to.
A guy called Pete Carroll, who is still a music industry identity in Perth and a great guy, he set up almost like a showcase of a whole number of bands.
In around about 94, I convinced John O'Donnell and John Watson to come over and have a look at what was going on. John O'Donnell at the time was running Murmur, and John Watson was the head of A&R for Sony. To indicate how little, I think, they particularly put any great store behind what was going on in Perth, they insisted that the only 2 days they could come over here were a Monday and Tuesday.
So the first band signed to Murmur was Ammonia. Second band signed was Silverchair. Everyone more or less remembers Silverchair, but Ammonia was a big signing for us, and they had a really great run and a really exciting run. Epic Records in the US were incredibly excited about Drugs, the first single, and the album Mint 400, and felt that they had a band here who could have a real shot.
I think had it not been for conflicts within the band, I think that they could have gone on to become much bigger.
The guys from Ammonia tipped me off to Jebediah very early, as did others, but they tipped me off and said this band's really worth watching and there's something exciting going on here.
Why you laughed up by your friends? Why you lost your words when everybody finally told you what they thought? You can't keep my best friend. Imagine it's fun how everybody always makes them in the end.
When you saw Jebediah in those early days, I mean, just the movement of the band, you know, watching Vanessa jumping around, it was obvious that they were really, really special. They had great songs.
A really important turning point with Ammonia and into Jebediah that I witnessed was the bands were happy to stay in Perth.
As far as we were concerned, our friends, our family, the rent was a lot cheaper here.
I was still living at home, you know. I was, you know, still getting dinner made by my mum and having my, you know, jocks washed by my mum. You know, I was in no position. I was in no way ready to move over east, I don't think. Perhaps if we'd signed directly to Sony, it might have been different. Well, it would have been. But fortunately, Murmur were pretty good and didn't put pressure on us to move.
Jebediah experienced like double platinum sales and really big success, and you know it went way beyond expectations for all of us. It showed bands in the Perth market that you know you could make it and stay proudly West Australian.
It made it seem possible
to
be a Perth band, not leave Perth, actually keep living here and get on the touring circuit and release records and be able to sell copies of those records and make a living out of playing music, and that's all you really want to do at the end of the day.
I distinctly remember at Mudslinger being like in the front row, like singing along to all the Jeb songs, and then like screaming out to Vanessa, Vanessa, set list, please, please. And I was yelling and I was yelling and I was yelling, and finally at the end of the set she relented and she gave me the set list. Dan had a Jebediah website. I mean, that's how much we loved him.
I remember first getting played on Triple J, and it seemed like such a heavy thing, like such a, it carried so much consequence, you know, like, because I just don't think there were Perth, apart from Ammonia, I don't think there was another band in Perth that got played on Triple J.
Triple J's national network that was emerging through that 90s period really opened the door for a lot of that alternative music. And when one band makes a break, when one band just opens that door, it creates an opportunity for several more. So for instance, when Jebediah broke and sold 150,000 plus of their debut album, inevitably people on the East Coast really started to take seriously what was going on here.
Jebediah consistently had a policy of taking local bands out on tour, which got bands like Beaver Loop and Turnstile and Red Jezebel and etc. exposed to a national audience, and I guess they always made a point of talking about WA bands in interviews.
Because they sort of led the way in that attitude, it sort of filtered on through all the bands that have come through, and you know, we still try and take West Australian bands and we go on tour.
Jebediah always supported Perth. They supported bands from Perth, and they stayed in Perth. And I think they did a great deal for this town.
If I'm so independent, why would you leave and I dig it up on one? To hide away till you come back like a bad activity moves. Where would I go? What would I do? I would be nowhere without you. Now I know heaven to love you. I could go. I just got naked on my own.
Everybody knows everybody. Everybody goes out with everybody. It's incredibly incestuous and so many levels.
When we sat down to our first record, me and my good friend Rodney Aravena, who's in End of Fashion, we'd played music together since we were like in our teenage years, and he was kind of involved in the demoing process of the first record. And then when we moved to this next house, like Luke from Sleepers was saying, oh, I need a bass player, and so I said, oh, you should try my friend Rodney out. So Rod ended up playing with the Sleepies, and that had Justin, and that's how Rod and Justin met. And then there was Katie, and Joel was helping Katie work with these songs with another friend of ours, Matt Checker, on drums. And then Simon came in, and then Joel recorded the first EP.
Previous to that, Katie wanted to play keyboards with us on the road. She was actually going to be our keyboardist on the road.
Right, yeah.
And then we heard
And then she wrote these incredible songs.
those demos, and we were like, you're not going on the road with us.
Live on the outside, I'll help you through your pain if you help me through mine. Never have I met someone as insensitive as you. I want to escape what you've done to my life. I love the way that you're always in my mind. It's okay, you're not about what you say. I can't help this pain that I feel.
With our first EP, like we got Joel from Eskies and Andy from the Avenues and Rod from End of Fashion to like sort of produce these songs that we had. And so they put their input in, and when Eskies are writing songs, they'll invite us down to go and listen to their jams and put something in.
Black fingernails, red wine, I wanna make you all mine. A lot of people underground, I wanna gather, you gotta go straight down.
We all kind of sit down and write songs together, because a lot of the time it's kind of like you'll come up with an idea, and sometimes it's refreshing to bounce song ideas off people who aren't in your band before you present it to the band.
It's quite easy to just, you know, find out what somebody's doing and just pop around and, you know, get drunk and say, oh, I've got an idea, and just start laying something down and, you know, completely put crap on their tracks.
There was a lot of jamming of like the guys from Sleepy's and us, and we were all jamming each other's songs and stuff. So the kind of styles were kind of getting a little bit intertwined as well. You know, like, you know, stuff with Life, like stuff like Life Is Better With You is got a real Sleepy's kind of thing going on. And I mean, I'm sure the same thing happened with those guys when they were writing their record.
All the Perth bands know how special this bond is and how rare it is, because you tour the country, you play with bands from all the different states, and you just get the feeling that in a lot of different places it's just a real cutthroat competition. You know, help another band with a song or an idea or production. What the hell are you talking about? We'd never do that, you know.
There isn't that sense of community. Like, it's more like, I hope this person doesn't do well, rather than I hope they do well, because they've taken my spot on, you know, this night here, or and over here it's just like, fucking good on you, go out there, do it.
It's quite a supportive group, the Perth scene, I think. I know that's my experience of it, particularly amongst the women. Like Sex Panther, a great example of girls that you can kind of compete against, but you can also go out and have a drink with them.
There's a competitiveness, you know, amongst the groups. You know, I'm sure you get everyone saying we're one big happy family. I think that's not the case at all. You know, everyone knows each other. I think it's really good. I think there's a healthy competition.
I found it hard to get into the actual scene. Like, for a while, as a new band, you know, there's a core number of bands which all play together, and
there's a whole bunch of bands just like us who are feeling like, you know, banging on the door, trying to get into that little scene or whatever. So it was hard to get in there.
Yeah, but once you sort of get into the scene, it's kind of, yeah, rollicks along.
When I think about this cancer on the road with hate, I say something got to give. Got the whole fighting for the Texas tea. Got a little for you, got a little for me, but
the group is so small, the circle is so small that from an outsider, like I was many years back, you can actually see the center of it, and you can see where it's happening in the epicenter, and you can see the players, and you can get to meet those people and get involved. And what happens when you're like in Sydney or Melbourne? It's such a huge scene. It's like, to be on the outside of that, it's completely foreboding and like, oh, I don't even know where to start.
A lot of people over east go, oh yeah, Perth must have a really good band scene. You go, well no, it's just the same probably 200 people going to every gig.
Yeah.
Supporting each other's mates' bands. Like if we saw like, you know, Eskies or something play, like everyone would at the time would turn up when they were doing small gigs and stuff. Now we just ask for names on the door, you know.
Yeah.
Hey Cav, put my name on the door.
But you remember when we
should
first
have to
started
ask.
playing, like Joel was, I think, our biggest supporter
Yeah.
from Eskies. Like, he was at every gig from the very first gig.
Eskimo Joel was one of the first people to give Kath Harrity, who ended up signing us, demos. He didn't have to do that. We didn't ask him to do it. He just did it.
Because, I mean, back then, it was kind of embarrassing to admit now, but I was like, you got Joel from Eskimo Joel at your gig. You felt like, you know, oh, we're going to be huge, eh? It's like you got someone like that coming to your shows.
They're putting back in just by being there. The fact that they actually, you know, have their little studios, you know, debaser and stuff, and you're going in there to record. When you're quite a young artist, you're probably pseudo in awe, but you're also just really excited. And those kind of things, I think a small community creates those kind of exciting, buzzy, really positive, somewhat naive in a really nice way, things that you may not get in a bigger city.
We're all kind of pushing each other, you know, and it is stepping up. The music's stepping up each time, and then someone comes out with a record, and it's like, you know, we have to do better than that.
To have the Sleepy Jackson's Lovers album kind of come out, be so special, so fantastic, so trippy, so pop, so great, and then to be hailed all around the world and really, really acclaimed all around the world in a profound way, was again a special thing.
It was noticeable, you know, what happened in the 12 months after the Sleepy Jackson's record, you know. And just the quality, how so many bands that were, you know, writing sort of pop songs on guitars, the quality of what bands were doing just improved so much and so quickly, and across the board, things really changed.
I left my heart in places, forgot every one of their faces, and tried to navigate a broken path of which I may have helped create. In any incident, this is never no accident, to stand alone and let the silence make itself at home.
Ambition is one thing that I think Perth has started to step up with.
I think it is the records, nothing but it. There's always been great live groups in Perth as far back as I can remember anyway, and I think just through a few really good releases, that's what sets the benchmark.
Well, my answer's always this, I said don't fight it, don't fight it, don't fight it. If you don't know what it is, if you don't know what it is, just don't fight it, don't fight it, don't fight it. If you don't know what it is, if you don't know what it is.
These days it's very simple to make something sound really good in your own home, and I think all the bands that we've sort of been surrounded by and been friends with have all had a passion for home recording, and that's, I think, a really powerful thing for a band to have.
A lot of bands now have the opportunity, particularly bands like the Eskimo Joes, Little Birdies and the Fashions, where even if they end up taking their demos to a big professional studio, they at least have a chance to nail their demos at a little home studio. They're not watching the clock, they're not paying a producer big bickies, and they can just spend longer, which means they're going to have more chance of getting the song right.
I remember thinking early on when Fourth Floor Collapse had just done some home recordings and
that's
released them, and they sounded great, and we were just like, wow, if you can do that in your home, then we should try and get to that level. And I remember that really spurred us on.
When we started actually making recordings, we want it to be an international quality. That's what we've always aimed for, kind of thing. We want it to sound as good as anything else we've got in our record collection.
Refuse
there's no barrier now between recording a song and getting it on the internet or in a form where people can hear it. The internet and technology has meant that while we don't have an advantage over any other states, we don't have that disadvantage anymore.
The challenge really for artists from here still remains, how do you get the live performance to other parts of the world, which is harder from here than anywhere else.
You got $4,000 or $2,500 in airfares before you can play a gig. It's prohibitively expensive.
Yeah, and it's hard to get to the rest of the Australian audience, where 20 million people live, on the other side of the country, and it's really hard to get their attention.
Toward the sun, and he cried so high, the boneyard rider, swear by blood and fire, my will be done.
The government has actually put some money, and this has really surprised me because I've never had the experience before, but actually surprised me by investing, I think, $5 million over 5 years in music.
We saw it as an area of great talent. We saw it as an area around youth culture, and wanted to grow that industry, to grow the talent and support it, because we saw the bands here in Perth as being some amongst the world's best.
The funding from Arts WA has had a massive, massive impact on the ability of WA music to get to the world.
Heaps of my friends' bands have recorded EPs off it or gone on tours supporting other Perth bands, and that's pretty huge. That's amazing.
The Silence was a really great example of, the fact that they got that grant for however much money meant that not only could they do the tour, but halfway through the tour they got a phone call from the people at Rove Live going, "We love you, come and play on the show next Tuesday."
Tonight's house band, ladies and gentlemen, say hello to the Silence!
There's no way that they would have been able to take advantage of that opportunity if they didn't have the grant money in the first place. 3 months later, when they got the phone call to go on tour with the Vines for their first Australian tour in 3 years, they could do that. If it wasn't for the government funding, there's no way that they would have been able to do that. And, the knock-on effect of that is that the Vines loved them so much that eventually the record label that's run by the Vines management decided to sign the band, which they did last week.
They don't make it too hard. If a tour comes up, for instance, if you're a West Australian band and you get accepted to go to the South by Southwest Music Festival in Texas, which we've been lucky enough to do, you automatically receive that grant.
Gyroscope is just an outstanding live band at South by Southwest a couple of years ago. You had half the band standing out in the street playing, and one of them trying to get on a bus when it was going past, and people are just there going, "What is this? What's going on here? We just haven't, we've never seen anything like this before." And we're kind of going, "It's just Gyroscope, that's just a band, just another band in Perth." So people here, they're far more aware of bands coming out of New York, and bands in New York are aware of bands coming out of Perth. And yet the people in Perth are aware of the bands coming out of Perth. They know what's in Sydney and Melbourne and Darwin, they know what's in London, and they know what's in Liverpool, they know what's in Texas, they know what's in LA. Because we're at the arse end of it all, we see everything. And at the same time, we're looking at all those things, and we're not seeing the crap out of those places, we're seeing the cream. So what we see out of New York is the cream of the crop. What we see out of Dublin is the cream of the crop, and that's what we go. That's how good we've got to be to play in New York. So we're not saying we have to be as good as the 38,000 other bands that play in New York. We say we've got to be as good as them at the top.
So, after some troubled beginnings, everything that seemed to hold the Perth scene back
is now working in its favour. It's stronger than ever before. But where to from here?
I'm really interested to see how Perth goes in the next few years. I'm hoping that with all this explosion in money in Western Australia, that it's not actually going to impact on the cultural side of things and the creativity side of things as well.
I love the fact that people are not being beaten down by the mediocrity around them in the case of, you know, the McMansion culture of rampant consumerism that is just abundant in Perth. It's kind of horrifying what the things you see that are happening to the city.
People just seem so interested in their affluence and their own sense of self-satisfaction that I could actually see more here that would actually spur young, creative people to actually get together and
bust out of it.
Yeah, bust out of it.
Let's keep this close, yeah, let's keep this closer. I got a lesson from you, I got a lesson from the Holy Ghost. 'Cause you once told me tonight, when I dared you didn't go my way. 'Cause you know this won't last. I got your soul now.
As Perth gets more and more attention and as technology makes the world smaller and smaller, it's going to be harder for Perth musicians to keep that innocence, you know?
It definitely feels like bands get noticed a lot quicker these days because of the whole Perth thing, and I think that, like you're saying, Brian, is really healthy. But ultimately, I think we'll always have that special Perth thing because we are just so isolated.
The rise of Western Australian music is a significant thing. I think it's going to get bigger and bigger.
The scene has been so good for a while that you don't want to analyse it too much, otherwise it might just disappear. You know, just keep enjoying being this far away from everyone else, because it's obviously working.
There are a lot of theories about why Perth's music scene is so good, and some have more relevance and currency than others. You know, is it because it's the most isolated city in the world? Is it because there's something in the water? Is it because an alien has landed and bred with the music makers of Perth? It doesn't matter. Go out, shut up, stop worrying about it, and enjoy the music.
Film buffs, you're in